Director of Education at Holocaust Museum Houston. Welcome to the second event of the Dismantling Bias, Antisemitism, White Supremacy, and Inequality lecture series presented by HEB. We extend a heartfelt thank you to HEB for their generous support in helping the museum host this important series of conversations. Before we begin, please note that the chat has been disabled and we ask that you place your questions in the Q&A link. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Tonight's lecture, Today's Anti-Semitism and its Relationship to Holocaust Denial and Distortion, is presented by Dr. Robert Williams. Dr. Robert Williams is Deputy Director for International Affairs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and a U.S. delegate to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, where he chairs the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial. He's also a member of the steering committee to the German government's Global Task Force on Holocaust Distortion. Dr. Williams advises several international bodies on issues related to Holocaust remembrance and anti-Semitism, and he's currently overseeing a major international initiative that assesses those laws and regulations that seek to curb denial of genocide and the Holocaust. His research specialties include German political culture, U.S. and Russian policy, and contemporary anti-Semitism. Please welcome Dr. Robert Williams.
Thank you for asking me to speak tonight. I want to extend a special note of thanks to the Holocaust Museum Houston, especially its CEO, Dr. Kelly Zuniga, and Wendy Warren, you, the Director of Education in the Boniek Center. I only wish circumstances would have allowed us to be in the same room this evening, but 2020 has been an interesting year for all of us. I'm going to pull up my slideshow now. Just bear with me one quick second. There we are, and let's expand that. Now, before we begin, I think it's worth noting that the subject of anti-Semitism, all forms of hate really, can trigger intense negative emotions. So if you think that you might find some of the content that we're going to discuss tonight to be traumatic or traumatizing, you may choose not to participate. Now, if nothing else, when you walk away from our discussion this evening, I want you to remember the following. First, anti-Semitism is a growing, adaptable, and persistent form of hatred. It's also not particular to any one religious group or any one culture or region. It has multiple influences that include but are not limited to religious bias, white nationalism, neo-Nazism, fascism, communism, populism, anti-Zionism, anti-globalism, extreme forms of Islamist ideology. Now, it's important to note that this is different from Islam as a faith, post-colonialism, anti-Americanism, and conspiracy thinking. Finally, perhaps most important of all, anti-Semitism is a threat, and it's not just a threat to individuals or to communities. It's a threat to our core institutions, to our shared international beliefs, and frankly, it's a threat to our democratic way of life. For our purposes today, we're going to use a very general understanding of anti-Semitism, essentially hatred of Jews or persons perceived of as Jewish. There are much more precise definitions, namely that forwarded by the committee that I chair at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is a 34-nation international organization. They have a so-called working definition of anti-Semitism that's been adopted by about 30 countries at the national level. It's also used by the US Department of State. But for the sake of time, we're going to use the simpler definition. If you have questions about more precise definitions, maybe we can tackle those for during the Q&A. So let's begin. And we should start where, for all intents and purposes, anti-Semitism originated and where it reached its most violent ends, namely in Europe. European anti-Semitism is a particular challenge. It certainly didn't end with the Second World War. It appeared from time to time over the course of the years after 1945, such as in the official policies of the Soviet Union, and it's certainly become an all too obvious threat over the last few years. In many ways, in Western Europe, this first struck home in 2015 with the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the siege of the Hypercacher market at the beginning of that year. And then later in the year, in November of 2015, during the terrorist attacks in Paris that claimed 130 innocent lives, those attacks themselves were motivated, at least in part, by an anti-Semitic bias. But the European challenge goes well beyond France, and in many ways, France is one of the more proactive countries trying to deal with anti-Semitism issues. In other parts of Europe, both Central and Eastern Europe, more familiar forms of this hatred continue to appear, particularly among the far right. Several recent studies, including an important survey that focused on the experiences of about 90% of EU Jewish communities, show the sad day-to-day reality. The survey that I mentioned found that 89% of respondents noted that anti-Semitism had increased in their countries. 20% reported that family members or close friends had been subject to physical or verbal attacks. Most disturbing of all, at least in my opinion, 79% said they don't go to the police to report these crimes. The majority saying the reason for not going to the police is that nothing would change. Crime statistics also show a significant rise. Let's just look at the 10-year period between 2009 and 2019, the year for which we have the most recent statistics. Now, to be fair, over that decade, in some countries, official rates of anti-Semitism fell. These countries included Belgium, France, Hungary, and Poland. Although in the case of the last two, it's kind of hard to make the claim over the course of 10 years because they changed their reporting statistics about 5 years ago. But in most cases, anti-Semitism increased over the course of that decade. In Sweden, it rose by 11%, in Germany by 20%, but in other countries, the swing upward was even more dramatic. In Austria, it rose by 150%, in Greece by 100%, and in Denmark by 292%, with a 96% increase just between 2018 and 19. Now, what are we to make of this? Well, it might actually be partially positive. In part, the rise of these statistics is due to the increased awareness that police agencies and policymakers have of anti-Semitism as a problem. But this isn't the only reason. It's worth noting that when we compare these official police statistics to those compiled by NGOs or Jewish communities, there are vast differences in the numbers, with much higher numbers coming from NGOs. Plus, remember, as I said at the beginning, 79% of people do not go to the police to report these crimes. So the problem could be worse than we think. But let's come a little closer to home. We Americans used to pride ourselves on the fact that violent anti-Semitism was relatively rare. There were a few major incidents. In 1862, for example, General Grant promulgated what was known as General Order Number 11 in my home state of Kentucky. This was an attempt to expel all Jews from Kentucky. He was partially successful in the case of Paducah. There was also the 1915 lynching of Leo Frank in Georgia during the height of lynching campaigns against African Americans. But by and large, at least by comparison with the European scene, the situation was not as violent. This has also clearly changed, as seen most horrifically through the multiple shootings aimed at Jewish communities since roughly the start of the 2014 with the Overland Park, Kansas shootings. In 2018, the year for which we have the most recent FBI statistics, 59% of all religious-based hate crimes, which is how the FBI assesses anti-Semitism, were directed at Jews. These 835 crimes included the 11 murders at the Tree of Life synagogue. Now, in contrast to these 835 crimes, the Anti-Defamation League found 1,879 criminal and non-criminal assaults on Jews and Jewish institutions that same year. And only a day or two ago, the American Jewish Committee determined that about 1/3 of Jews in the United States have experienced anti-Semitism at some point over the last 5 years. 3% of the respondents to that AJC survey had been the victims of physical assaults. 82% of American Jews believe that anti-Semitism has increased. Now, non-Jews in the United States aren't as certain. The figures were significantly less. But perhaps most disturbing, the AJC study determined that 47% of non-Jews aren't even quite certain what the term anti-Semitism means. Now, what accounts for the rise of anti-Semitism in the States? Well, there are multiple factors. One that we can't shy away from is the fact that hate groups have risen considerably over the course of the last decade or so. In last year, for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center identified 1,020 extremist groups, both left and right, across the United States, a significant number of which are animated, at least in part, by anti-Semitism. This is also due to the rise of conspiracy theories, such as the QAnon conspiracy, which shares some themes similar to old anti-Semitic conspiracies, in which by itself is becoming increasingly anti-Semitic in its focus. I would also argue that the rise of anti-Semitism in the US is due to a decline in our awareness that we have a civic responsibility to learn and to counter to hatred in all of its forms. Now, we're not an island. This is a North American problem. And in Mexico and Canada, there are also indicators that anti-Semitism could be on the rise. We also need to talk about what's happening right now. I think we can all recognize that times of strife and struggle make worse already existing problems. So what's the effect of COVID-19? Sadly, there's a lot of evidence showing that anti-Semitic myths are being tied to the pandemic. By my count, there are at least 7 types of conspiracies, anti-Semitic conspiracies tied to COVID-19. These include claims that 1, Jews created the virus, 2, that they're responsible for its spread, 3, that they profit from COVID-19, 4, that they derive some pleasure from the deaths of non-Jews, 5, that the pandemic somehow disproves the reality of the Holocaust, 6, there are religious leaders of all types claiming that it's punishment from God on Jews, and 7, a very significant rise in the misuse of images that evoke the Holocaust by demonstrators who are opposed to the various forms of national pandemic response. And this is something we see across the board, both in Europe and in North America. Now, it's hard to predict what this is going to mean. In the short run, I think we're going to see a dip in physical anti-Semitic attacks over the course of the year, simply because of lockdowns and other measures. But some organizations, including the World Jewish Congress, are already reporting significant upticks in online anti-Semitism. Now, surely, we're smart people after all. We can separate the reality of a viral pandemic from far-fetched conspiracies, right? Well, anti-Semitism has long been linked to disease. The hateful idea of Jews as a contagion began in the Middle Ages during the bubonic plague. It was something that was carried through the Nazi period. Here we have a propaganda poster from German-occupied France, not just linking Jews, but saying Jews were akin to tuberculosis, syphilis, or cancer. And it carries through today. This is a sign that was displayed at a protest in Columbus, Ohio this spring. This is what I mean when I say anti-Semitism is an ever-changing but persistent form of hate. Many of today's expressions of anti-Semitism harken back to earlier forms. Let's dive a bit deeper. On the far left, we have an image from a Soviet publication called Crocodile. It makes the not so subtle suggestion that Israeli troops are the new Nazis aided and abetted by the United States. Next to that, we have a cartoon from only a couple of years ago, drawn by a Brazilian cartoonist with ties to anti-Zionist causes, where the same claim is being made. We go even farther into the past. Top right, we have a postcard from Austria in 1919. It suggests that Jews on the home front stabbed Austrians in the back, which explains their loss in the First World War. Below that, a recent image from Al Arabiya suggesting that Jews or Israel, it's not entirely clear from the image, conspired with the United Arab Emirates to stab Palestinians in the back. But we need to remember that anti-Semitism doesn't exist in isolation. After all, most anti-Semites don't restrict their hatred just to Jews. At times, anti-Semitic themes are applied to non-Jewish groups. In Europe, for example, we see anti-Semitic tropes applied to Roma populations and to Muslim populations. Now, this does not mean that anti-Roma bias or Islamophobia are the same as anti-Semitism. They're not. Each form of hatred has a particular history and a particular context, but they overlap and inform one another at times. So here, for example, on the left, we have the cover page of a Nazi newspaper from the 1930s. It includes an anti-Semitic caricature of a Jew preying upon a German woman. To the right, the cover of a 2016 right-wing publication from Poland with the not-so-subtle cover statement, "The Islamic Rape of Europe." Different targets, different contexts, but similar expressions of hatred. Now, fortunately, for many of us in the States, these features of anti-Semitism are kind of obvious. We can recognize them. But for some of us, it's also not altogether clear how Holocaust denial and certainly Holocaust distortion might be anti-Semitic. So for the majority of my talk this evening, I'm going to really focus on these aspects quite a bit more. First, a brief history lesson. Probably won't surprise you to learn that Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion began during the Holocaust. There were certain Nazi euphemisms, for example, such as special treatment, that were used to obscure the crimes being committed. But there were also official efforts, such as Special Action 1005, which was a organized effort to exhume mass graves using slave labor, including Jewish slave labor, to remove all evidence of the murders that had taken place, especially those on the Eastern Front. It took place over the course of the years between 1942 and late 1944. Here's a photograph of part of that operation. It shows 3 slave laborers standing next to what was unfortunately aptly known as the bone crushing machine. Now, through much of the Cold War, silence, or at least an unwillingness for public discussion on Nazi crimes, contributed to, well, sweetening the field, if you will, for forms of distortion and denial to emerge in both Eastern and Western Europe, as well as in North America. But distortion and denial are not the same thing. Denial is a bit easier to grasp. The goal of denial is to convince people that the Holocaust and related atrocities did not happen. In doing so, Holocaust deniers are trying to make anti-Semitism acceptable. They're trying to provide legitimacy for Nazism, or they're trying to claim that the Holocaust was a product of the Jewish imagination, and so on and so on. Denial is anti-Semitic, and there is no debate about this. It's a significant problem, but it's also considerably less common these days than distortion of the Holocaust. So what's distortion? Well, it's tricky. At the simplest level, distortion acknowledges the reality of the Holocaust, at least in part, and it appears as rhetoric, written work, or other media that can variously excuse, minimize, or misrepresent the Holocaust and or its relevance today. I would also argue that Holocaust distortion is a much more insidious threat in some ways. In part, this is because it's difficult to determine why people distort the Holocaust. Are they doing it because they're cynical and hateful? Or do they just not know the facts? Regardless, allowing for or excusing Holocaust distortion erodes our understanding of the Holocaust. It's a moral insult to the memories of the victims and the survivors. And finally, it can act as a gateway drug, if you will, to conspiracy theory, to Holocaust denial, and to much deadlier forms of anti-Semitism. So let's look at a few examples. We're going to start with something old, but perhaps a bit more familiar. Denial and distortion efforts have long played hob with the well-known historical record of the Holocaust. One of the earliest conceits, especially in the 70s and 80s, was to claim that there was no evidence that Hitler had ordered the Holocaust. Now, this is based on a partial truth. There is no single document in which Hitler orders the mass murder of all the Jews of Europe and North Africa. These orders were given in coded language and often in person. Nevertheless, there are scores of evidence. They include a December 1942 report sent from Heinrich Himmler to Hitler outlining the murder of 363,211 Jews between August and November 1942. This is a scan of that order. There was also a phone log from Hitler to Himmler in which Hitler suspended the liquidation of a train of Jews because they wanted to interrogate a prisoner on board. Short version is the Nazis thought that the son of the Russian foreign minister, Molotov, might have been on board. He wasn't. But if Hitler didn't know about the liquidation process or where the train was going, how could he have ordered it to have been stopped? There are innumerable secondhand reports of a so-called Führer order by Nazi elite. Heck, even Himmler's masseur, Felix Kirsten, was aware of an order from Hitler. Now, these historical games continue today, but we also see less obvious attempts to distort the history. Asserting that the Holocaust is not relevant to a nation's history because it was a crime carried out by the Nazis could be a form of Holocaust distortion, because these arguments could ignore the roles played by local collaborators or members of the Axis in Holocaust crimes. Here on the top left, for example, we have a photograph of a former Romanian president, Ion Iliescu, who in July 2003 echoed earlier claims that the Holocaust had been insignificant in Romania and that, quote, the Holocaust was not unique to the Jews. This wasn't only factually wrong. After the Nazis, the Romanians, who were members of the Axis with Germany, were responsible for the second highest number of crimes. It also led to an international outcry. This was followed by a series of historical commissions. I'm privileged to work with a couple people who were on those commissions. and a number of structural and educational changes in Romania that have led to that country today becoming one of the few Central European countries to have a healthy relationship with this past. This shows the value of engaging with the history in an honest way and engaging in fruitful dialogue. Other photos here include references to the way that everyday people profited from the Holocaust, such as this picture of agents from a Dutch organization during the German occupation of the Netherlands. The members of this organization worked with the Nazis to liquidate Jewish businesses. On the bottom right, we have a plaque from Bulgaria that notes wartime Jewish slave labor in the country, a plaque that set off a historical firestorm, if you will, because Bulgarian identity, in part, is based on that country's legacy as a rescuer. Now, asserting that the number of victims of the Holocaust was several millions of persons less than the accepted figure of approximately 6 million Jews is also a form of Holocaust distortion. Now, to be fair, scholars don't agree on an exact number because wartime archives and records of pre-war Jewish populations are often incomplete, but scholarly estimates range between 5.3 and 6.2 million victims, with 5.7 as a more or less accepted figure. Anything significantly less is at least problematic. Blaming Jews for the Holocaust. Shocking, right? This form of victim blaming variously claims that Jewish reactions to the rise of Nazism or that Jewish participation in certain political movements justified the Nazis' persecution of Jews. These are forms of Holocaust distortion because they're not only historically inaccurate, they also lessen the burden of guilt by perpetrators and suggest that the Holocaust was somehow justifiable. In parts of Eastern Europe today, this shows up as offhand references to Judeo-communism, that is, the misbelief that Jews were overwhelmingly communist. This assertion is occasionally a coded suggestion that the Holocaust was merely an anti-communist action. There are also those who suggest that something in the supposedly Jewish character, an old anti-Semitic theme, led to the Holocaust. This was a statement espoused recently by, among others, Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas in 2018. It can also be found in irresponsible references to the roles played by Jewish police in some of the ghettos in Nazi-occupied regions. There are forms of distortion that also cast the Holocaust as something positive. Now, this appears in two ways. Sometimes as sarcastic memes, but more often through assertions that the Nazis were correct to launch the Holocaust and they should have, quote, finished the job. This latter form is clearly a bald-faced form of anti-Semitism. There are plenty of persons who accuse the Jews of using the Holocaust for a variety of purposes. For example, claiming that Jewish people used the reality of the Holocaust to justify the establishment of the State of Israel or for the purposes of financial gain. These assertions may not necessarily distort the history, but they do distort the relevance of the subject and include other forms of anti-Semitic conspiracy within them. I think we can agree that the Holocaust has become a symbol of ultimate evil. It's perhaps understandable then that people, organizations, or movements would seek to compare the Holocaust to unrelated causes, contemporary events, even other genocides or mass atrocities. Now, I'm not saying that comparison doesn't have benefits. It does as an analytical tool. But if it's done irresponsibly, it can distort not just understanding of the Holocaust, but the thing to which it's being compared. Often this can consist of comparisons between communism and Nazism. Now, both were terrible. Both led to the deaths of millions. And both need to be decried. But they were different. Similarly, attempts to link animal rights, for example, to the Holocaust is also problematic because the victims of both exist, quite frankly, on a different moral plane. Both deserve discussion, but the contexts are completely different. Now, this one's a bit tricky. It's increasingly common to see nations use the history of the Holocaust for a variety of purposes. This can consist of state-sponsored condemnations, implicit or explicit, against the historical actions of other countries during the course of the Holocaust. And this is a form of propaganda that began during the Cold War, such as when East Germany would claim that all Nazis ended up in West Germany. But it continues today as well. How does it work? Well, sometimes it can appear somewhat innocuously, such as when a state-run museum presents imagery from the Nazi era without proper historical context. It can also appear in a bit more overt fashion. Let's take this billboard, for example. This billboard popped up in Crimea right before it was taken over by the Russian Federation. It suggests that Crimeans had two choices. Rule by the Nazis, a less than subtle reference to Ukraine, or peace under the Russian Federation. There are also attempts, and this strikes some people as odd, but there are attempts even today to honor people whose actions or words helped inform Holocaust-related crimes. This is not just a problem in former perpetrator countries. It happens in countries that were occupied by the Nazis, in countries that were neutral, in countries where the Holocaust did not occur, and in countries that were part of the alliance with the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. What I'm saying is this is a shared problem and it needs a shared solution. Now, how does this happen? Well, at times the so-called, we'll call them rehabilitated. The so-called rehabilitated have been subject to official processes, such as when a high court overturns a long past judicial sentence. On the bottom left, for example, the man standing to the far left was known as Leon Rupnik. Well, that was his name. He was tried in the late 1940s and sentenced to death. His sentence was overturned in January of this year by the Slovenian Supreme Court. Other times, parliaments have taken official action to rehabilitate perpetrators. This has happened in Ukraine, among other countries, around certain members of what was known as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, a body that had been complicit not just in crimes against Jews, but in the deaths of tens of thousands of ethnic Poles. Sometimes the complicit have undergone what we might call cultural rehabilitation because they were cultural luminaries, well-known authors and the like. There are also persons who escaped justice but went on to acclaim. Among these are a few of the German scientists we brought to the United States to work on our rocket program. There are also those persons who remain venerated by certain religious authorities, a factor that I'm sure many of you can appreciate complicates matters, to say the least. The use of Holocaust-related images is very tricky, and it can also invite distortion. Sometimes this occurs through the use of language associated with the Holocaust to cast aspersions on other people. Other motivations could seem more innocent, such as an attempt to fictionalize the Holocaust for the purposes of entertainment or for purely commercial gain. So here, for example, we have a Russian figure skater wearing a half Nazi, half Holocaust victim costume. We also have some Christmas ornaments emblazoned with images from Auschwitz. These were sold on Amazon until recently. Finally, perhaps even more staggering, there was also a company trying to sell Anne Frank Halloween costumes. Now, when it comes to reminiscent images, some are obvious and some are not. Here, for example, we have the flag of the Greek Golden Dawn Party. Incidentally, its leadership was recently sentenced to prison. The symbol on their flag is called the meander, and it's technically drawn from Greek art. It's meant to represent bravery in an eternal struggle, but its shape and use of colors is, it's the saying, on the nose. It's a bit obvious. What about these? Now, most of us would probably see something problematic in the flag of the All German Heathens Front. This is a neo-Nazi organization with branches in Germany, the Scandinavian countries, and the Netherlands. Similarly, if we were in Taiwan and went to get a haircut and saw the Berlin Hair Salon in Hsinchu City, Taiwan, we might raise an eyebrow. The German government became aware of this and they intervened to have this sign changed. But what about this? Here we have a group of American white nationalists holding the flag of the Romanian Iron Guard. That is the anti-Semitic and fascist party of Romania that existed between 1927 and 1941. To identify the problem here, we might need a somewhat deeper knowledge of the subject. What about this? Well, we can also be fooled. This is a perfectly innocent flag. It's the flag of the city of Amsterdam. Its origins lie in the 17th century. I include it in presentations to show you that although we need to remain vigilant against distortion and encroaching anti-Semitism, there's not always a monster under every rock. To make sure we have some time for discussion, I'm going to bring this home and leave you with a few suggestions on how we can respond to the challenges we have today. First, to paraphrase H.G. Wells, we are in a race between education and catastrophe. And I'm afraid catastrophe is pulling ahead. We need to enhance educational opportunities and not just at the secondary school level. Beyond the essential foundations of the secondary school, we need to engage with the Holocaust, with anti-Semitism, and with other types of history at the university, in our trade schools, in professional education courses, and in the training of our civil servants. Moreover, to support all of this, there need to be more outside of the classroom opportunities to learn. And the best places to do that are through the development of museums and exhibitions dedicated to these subjects. Political responsibility is key. As mentioned earlier, the Holocaust is often a topic that's been misused to fit all manner of political, cultural, and ideological ends. Societies, governments, and citizens must speak out against its misuse. We cannot allow the Holocaust to continue to be a cudgel that one person uses against another. New media. Now, there's been a lot of talk, as I'm sure you've seen in the press, about the need for social media companies to tackle online hate and to remove it from their platforms. And that's fair. But what's our responsibility? We need to figure out better ways to communicate against anti-Semitism, racism, denial, distortion, and other problematic forms of expression. And we need to figure it out on our own. Frankly speaking, those who sow hate are much better at reaching vulnerable groups than we are. Finally, we need to build engagement. We need to develop opportunities for regular and constructive dialogue between like-minded causes and like-minded institutions on these issues. This is not a competition. We are all in it together. And only by working together will we be able to push back against attempts to breed hate and to create what we could call conveniently imagined realities. If we don't do this, I'm afraid we're going to continue to fall into some state of decline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. And we're so happy to have you here tonight, and we have a lot of questions for you. Okay, so I'm going to begin with the first question is kind of two parts. If they would like you to comment on Holocaust distortion in some specific countries, specifically Lithuania and Hungary, each having their own particular issues at this time.
Mm-hmm. They do. All right, I'm full disclosure, much more familiar with the Lithuanian situation than I am the Hungarian situation, although I do have quite a bit of awareness of what's happened there over the course of the last decade or so. I think it's important to note in both cases, a lot of what we read, especially in the English language press, is one side of the story. It's usually the negative side of the story, and there's reason to focus on that. There are troubling signs of efforts to distort the history in both of these countries, as well as in many other countries. But what we don't always find, and let's take the Lithuanian case, are stories that also cover the positive steps that are being taken by some Lithuanian government officials and some Lithuanian institutions to counter these trends. The Lithuanian foreign minister, for example, has been excellent on these issues over the last couple of years. And there's some really strong Holocaust-focused institutions in Lithuania, such as the Vilna Gaon Museum in Vilnius, and frankly, the faculty at Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas, who have been doing a lot of good work. So with that said, yes, there have been a number of disturbing trends. We'll start with the Lithuanian case. In Lithuania, really since the 1990s, because Lithuania rightfully has been reframed its identity on anti-communism because they pushed the Soviets out, they have tried to identify heroes from the past. The problem is a lot of the heroes of the past, especially those from the 1940s, were persons who had also been complicit in crimes against Jews during the German occupation of Lithuania. Many of these people belong to an organization called the Lithuanian Activist Front. In the slideshow I had, there was an individual who had a plaque on a wall. That man's name was Jonas Noreika. Noreika was one of these people. Noreika had been part of the anti-Soviet resistance before the German occupation. And during the German occupation, for a time, he was a police official who cooperated with the Nazis and actually was engaged in the liquidation of one Jewish community, or at least its property. and then ended up actually being arrested by the Nazis for a time, returned to Lithuania after the war and was killed by the Soviets. He has a very complicated past, but some in Lithuania have looked at Noreika and decided to look at his past from a certain point of view, focus on the good, not the bad. So Noreika has become venerated really since the 1990s on and off, and there's been a lot of debates about Noreika as a result, but Noreika is just one of many who fall into this category. Hungary, there have been different cases over the years. It's important there to note that yes, there are cases of official distortion, especially focused on Admiral Miklos Horthy, who had been the regent of Hungary, Hungary was an Axis ally. They were allies with the Germans during the war. And there have been these attempts to rehabilitate people like Horthy or to engage in trying to reshape how the Holocaust is taught. I will say, despite all the problems, the Hungarian government has maintained open dialogue on these issues, and we'll have to see what comes over the next few years.
Thank you. Next question is, what are the current or future initiatives that USHMM is undertaking to address contemporary anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial or distortion?
Well, I can't speak for the whole of the museum. I can only speak in that regard for some of the work that we are doing and some of the work that's underway in my office, which is the Office of International Affairs. I do know in the education side of the museum, there is a dedicated focus on anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion. That program mostly focuses on international education efforts to teach the value of the Holocaust, to kind of act proactively to stop distortion before it forms, particularly among some of the Muslim communities in Europe, as well as Muslim communities in the Middle East and North Africa. So they're very, very active there. From my part, as you mentioned I need to rewrite my bio. It's slightly embarrassing, but in my capacity, I regularly advise a number of governments on these issues and act as a sounding board for some of the ideas that come our way. I mentioned the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. That's a document that has been adopted by a number of countries to kind of frame how they respond to and understand anti-Semitism. The German government has this global task force on Holocaust denial and distortion that I'm also a part of on behalf of the museum. I'm the only non-German at the steering committee level. And that will lead to a series of policy recommendations and guidelines that we hope will be adopted by governments so that they can support the development of museums, training programs, and better track and understand denial and distortion issues. So there's a lot happening, but not enough, or so much that I can't possibly answer it in the next 1 to 2 minutes.
Okay, we've had several questions about education here in the United States. And so how can educators discuss the history and the legacies of anti-Semitism in the US within their classrooms?
There's a few ways to do this. And, it's important, I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this. It's important to realize that it's not all just about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a terrible event, and it's a very important event in Jewish history. And I would argue the Holocaust is an important event in world history. You need to remember that I'll come back to your question, but this is an important tangent to go on. The Holocaust so fractured our common understanding and our common civilization that we needed to create new international institutions to deal with the damage that it had wrought. The Holocaust influenced the development of the UN, most of the human rights norms that we live under today. The Holocaust is an important part of our history, and it's part of our shared global history, so that needs to be taught. But beyond that, we also need to teach Jewish history, but not just Jewish history as Jewish history, something separate, but Jewish American history if it's part of the US context, or Jewish Lithuanian history if it's part of the Lithuanian context, to the ways that Jewish citizens have helped create our societies. So if we're talking about George Washington, talk about Haim Solomon, right? If you're talking about the scourge of lynching across the United States in the 20th century, or the period after Reconstruction, an important part of that is not just to talk about the lynching of Italian Americans in Louisiana at the same time as the lynching of the many more lynchings of African Americans, but also the lynching of Leo Frank and how that was informed by anti-Semitism. These are all parts of a shared history. They need to be integrated better, and only by integrating our histories are we going to avoid separating. So I think that's a simple way to answer it, but there are much more nuanced approaches as well.
How should we deal with the general problem of intentional misinformation?
That's a toughie, and there are a few different ways. It's hard, right? At the end, I mentioned the fact that we need to become better communicators, and I think that's critical. We need to figure out what's going to hook people in and make them interested in the subject. And I wish I could say that I had the answer to that, but I really don't. I think part of it is a return to some sort of civic and moral education. Not moral education from a particular ideological or religious perspective, but we need to kind of reinstill some sort of communal values in the way we learn and the way we think about our relationships to one another, and that will help. But we also need to develop, for lack of a better term, counter narratives. And whether it is fact checking or whether it is making available good, solid histories so that people can engage with those when they have questions about the past, I'm not quite sure. When it's specific to Holocaust issues, however, I will say that my home institution and a number of other institutions as well have really good online resources. So from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum perspective, we have a massive online encyclopedia of the Holocaust that covers a great many of the topics that are critical to understanding the subject. And we did something that I think is really admirable in a lot of ways, and I credit my colleagues in the education office for this. We've translated a great number of those articles into a variety of languages as well. So you really need, but you have to make the effort, and getting people to make that effort is part of the challenge.
How will the loss of Holocaust survivors and our transition to a post-Holocaust survivor world impact Holocaust distortion and denial?
That one is, in many ways, the million-dollar question for our field. And I don't mean to sound flippant by saying that, but it's a very difficult moment we find ourselves in. We are obviously very close to losing the last of the survivor and eyewitness generation. The survivors in particular have a strength and a calming influence on these discussions. I've been privileged enough to participate in enough discussions with survivors over the years that there's an authority that they bring that an historian doesn't necessarily bring to the subject. There are some efforts underway to the USC Shoah Foundation, for example, have been using holographic technologies so that you can engage in a conversation with survivors to a certain extent. There are a number, tens of thousands, frankly, at this point, of video recorded testimonies of survivors that you can watch. But at the end of the day, I'm an historian, and let's come back to that idea of the Holocaust as a civilizational break. One of the other civilizational breaks that we've seen was the French Revolution, right? Well, the French didn't really begin to wrestle with the French Revolution as a foundational moment and to begin to understand it until about 70 odd years after the event, through the writings of, in this case, Alexis de Tocqueville and other French historians. The subject became normalized and part of the general consciousness. So although we are losing the survivors, the effect that they've had on creating a field of education, remembrance, and research, I hope will lead to the conditions necessary to make sure that our memory of the Holocaust is active and present in a way akin to the American or French Revolution, and to use those two examples.
Can you speak to the relationship between the BDS movement or the Israeli divestment movement and anti-Semitism?
To an extent. I think it's important to note that boycott as a means of protest is something that has some considerable validity. Boycott was used in the US civil rights movement. Boycott was used to protest apartheid-era South Africa. But in many of those cases, it was an informed boycott movement. So I don't want to say boycott is a bad thing, but specific to the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which was started in the UK and which has been focused on Israel, that movement and the people who were involved in its establishment have well-known records of engaging in a form of anti-Semitism that often masks his critique of Israel. Now, I'm not saying that criticizing Israel is necessarily anti-Semitic. There are perfectly valid reasons to criticize any country's policies, but the founders of that movement crossed a threshold. So the formal movement itself, I think there's no question, has engaged in anti-Semitic tactics and is incredibly problematic. Many of the activists in the North American context, let's say, who sign on to some of these BDS movements, I'm not sure how aware of this they are, or how aware they are of the ways by which they're expressing themselves, that the ways they're expressing themselves are by default anti-Semitic. So in my opinion, well, first of all, I need to say this, boycotting just shuts a door in a lot of ways, particularly if you're saying, well, let's take the case from some American college campuses. If we say, if an American college says we're not going to allow any scholars from Israel to come to our campus and speak to our students or teach our students, all you're doing is slamming a door. You're ending dialogue before it can ever begin. So it is counterproductive. To overcome that, we really need to engage with students to teach them the differences between legitimate critique of a particular country's policies and anti-Semitic critique of those policies. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Some tools like that IRA definition that I mentioned are helpful in that, but it takes a sustained effort.
Can you add a little more information to the work you did on the IRA definition and how difficult that process was, and how having that definition supports the work to fight anti-Semitism?
Sure, I think it's important to note that it was very much a group effort. My predecessor chair was critical in moving that ball across the line, as was the leadership. When I said earlier that Romania has become a leader in these issues, I wasn't kidding. The Romanian government actually helped pass that document within the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016. So that definition is based in part on a definition that was forwarded in the early 2000s within a now defunct organization with the initials of which were the EUMC, it was an EU body. It was the product of compromise and dialogue over the course of a couple of years between subject matter experts, diplomats, advocates, and scholars. The definition that passed through the IRA changed certain aspects of that definition, but it ultimately passed the then 31 countries that were at the IRA. The IRA is now 34 countries. It was passed as an educational tool to sensitize people to the different forms of anti-Semitism that occur. It has since, without lobbying by the IRA, been adopted at the national level by a number of countries. These countries are implementing it in different ways. So you have some countries like the United Kingdom and Romania, where they've integrated the definition into their civil service training programs and into police programs to track various forms of anti-Semitism. I think the Czech government is trying to do the same. Other countries have adopted it and are still trying to figure out how they're going to move forward. My colleagues in the European Union will be issuing a handbook relatively soon on some best practices to implement that definition. So I'll be happy to share that. I think that's in early December is the target date for that. But it wasn't easy.
Yeah.
I can tell you it wasn't easy. There were a number of countries that were and still are opposed to some of the definition contains 11 examples of the different types of anti-Semitism. And getting some of these countries to agree to those examples has been challenging.
Is Germany currently experiencing a rise in Holocaust denial or distortion?
Distortion, yes. The let's just take the anti-COVID demonstrations that have taken place over the course of the last few months, especially in August in parts of Berlin and elsewhere. The photograph that I showed of the Holocaust era, again, David, had the word ungeimpft on it, which is unvaccinated. That was a photograph taken from one of the Berlin protests. You're seeing the use of Holocaust reminiscent imagery in these protests and rhetoric along the lines of, we are the new victims today, by some of the anti-vaccination protesters. You're also seeing the same sort of misuse occurring in parts of North America. Distortion has not been as problematic in the German case because, quite frankly, the Germans are the leaders in making certain that people engage with the Holocaust in the European context. I'm not saying it does not occur. It does occur in some of these fringe movements, but it's not as pressing as it is in some other countries. Anti-Semitism, however, has clearly been on the rise in anti-Semitism over the last couple of years. Primarily among the far right, but also among some of the Muslim migrant groups in Germany. And, but like the attack on the synagogue in Halle is one case in point. But so too have there been strange incidents of anti-Semitism over the last few years. In 2014, for example, a synagogue in the city of Wuppertal was firebombed. The persons who committed that crime did so putatively because they were opposed to Israeli policies, but rather than throw a Molotov cocktail at the consulate or the embassy, they decided to attack a local Jewish institution. And unfortunately, a German court let that case go. I think understanding of anti-Semitism has matured a bit since that event, but it's still something that has clearly risen over the last couple of years.
With the rise of anti-Semitism recently, do you think there needs to be changes to Holocaust education?
I think it needs to. So I was part of a project. There's a 57 nation international organization called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I was part of a group that advised on the establishment of education guidelines on anti-Semitism. And what we found is that most countries, in their attempts to deal with anti-Semitism, have focused just on Holocaust education and not on ensuring that there's respect for cultural pluralism or an understanding of the roles of Jews in local society, and so on and so forth. I think Holocaust education is critical. I think it needs to be expanded, but I also think it needs to be buttressed by those other forms of education that I was discussing earlier, because only through understanding a community through all of its nuances and not just one particularly terrible event, can you kind of build that understanding that's necessary to limit anti-Semitism and other forms of bias when they occur.
How does making Holocaust denial against the law impact levels of Holocaust denial and distortion?
I think it's hard to say. There are, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers at this point. I believe it's 21 of we'll leave the UK out, the 27 EU member countries that have Holocaust denial laws on the books. They differ in part, and some of the laws are written so that you can't deny facts, and some of the laws are written so that you can't deny narratives. The ones that deny facts, I think, are probably a little more effective in dealing with Holocaust denial because they say that you're twisting the facts and that's an act of hate. Those that protect certain narratives can be twisted to actually engage in other forms of Holocaust distortion. There's a law in the Russian Federation, for example, that fits that mold. How effective are they? Nobody's done an absolute study, but I'll give you a very simple correlation. The first significant Holocaust denial law passed in 1990 in France. That became the model for most of these Holocaust denial laws. Very quickly after the French law passed, one country after the other began passing these laws. So these laws are new, is what I'm trying to say. At the same time these laws are new, anti-Semitism's increased. So, and maybe it's just my very American background. I think open speech and open dialogue over the long term is a better solution than banning speech. Because as these forms of hate have been criminalized, it certainly doesn't seem to have had an immediate effect on decreasing incidents of anti-Semitism.
Recently, Facebook and Twitter, of course, made the news of banning Holocaust denial on their sites. How do you think that will impact anti-Semitism in terms of the social media world?
Yeah, I'm hoping it gives us a breather. You know, we're all wrestling with how to deal with the constant barrage of information that comes to us through social media platforms or through video sharing sites like YouTube. And so I'm hoping that by these companies pledging to take the steps to take down forms of hate, it will give us a breather so that we can kind of return to the center, right? So that we don't have to deal with filtering out on our own or determining on our own what are extreme points of view, and that we can return to some sort of moderate dialogue through these fora. But I think at the end of the day, we're still going to have to wrestle with the fact that there are all of these opportunities for more forms of communication. We need to learn how to deal with it. It's not a great parallel, but to give a historical parallel. In Weimar Germany, the democratic state that existed between the end of the First World War and the Nazi rise to power in 1933. The democracy and freedom of expression was guaranteed by law. There were 20,000 odd newspapers, both daily and weekly, for a very small population, a constant barrage of information. The majority of these newspapers weren't like American newspapers used to be. Our newspapers used to try to be neutral. The newspapers in Weimar Germany had all manner of political and ideological perspectives. There was a constant barrage of information from the perspective of a 1920s German. You had the far right, the far left, everything in between. And sorting this out was in some ways difficult for the German population, which radicalized politics to a certain degree, especially during periods of economic collapse and the like. So I think to a certain extent, we're dealing with that today, but in an online space with even more information, and information that's coming to us, quite literally every millisecond. And we haven't figured out how to deal with it.
We're almost out of time, so I'm going to give you one last question.
Sure.
Do you have any recommendations of books or documentaries or reports that someone can use to really learn more about contemporary anti-Semitism?
So Deborah Lipstadt, who is a professor at Emory University, just published a very accessible book on anti-Semitism that I would certainly recommend. It has an interesting approach where it consists of semi-fictionalized letters between herself and a faculty colleague and a student. And I think that's a really good way to become familiar with some of the issues that are being faced today. There are a number of very good reports that have come out just recently on the state of anti-Semitism, both abroad and here at home. I mentioned earlier, there's an American Jewish Committee study that came out a day and a half ago. Certainly worth looking at. There's some very good explainers there. Some of these issues have also been interrogated by the Anti-Defamation League. In the European context, I would look at the reports of an organization called the Community Security Trust in the United Kingdom. They've done a lot of work on online hate and radical groups online, both at the left and the right. And although they are government reports, it's known as the Agency for Fundamental Rights, or the FRA. It's the EU's hate crimes reporting body. They have an annual anti-Semitism report that not only gives you the statistics, but it has very nice explanations of how they understand anti-Semitism and how it's appearing in various EU countries.
Okay, thank you so much. We really thank you for being with us tonight and sharing so much information. It was very important, an important conversation that we need to have today in society. I want to thank all our guests for joining us tonight, and we hope to see everyone at our next Dismantling Bias lecture on November 11th, which will be a conversation with Cole Brown, the author of Gray Boy, Finding Blackness in a White World. So thank you again, Dr. Robert Williams, and we hope to see everybody here again soon. Good night.
Thank you.